SECfans.com. Week 3, we are going to get into right now a few of our game previews if you're listening to the podcast. And if you're listening on YouTube, we tend to chop these up to kind of give each one their due. Again, I've got Husky Pup in the house giving me a little bit of analysis, filling in the gaps since I don't have as much nerd as he does. And I think that's what this show's all about. So he certainly brings that. Last week, we covered a couple of really high-profile games, Husky, and this week we want to get into a few of these teams that we haven't talked as much about. And the first one I'd love to talk about is Mississippi State and LSU, two teams that we don't still, kind of like it's been the recurring theme so far this year, we don't know a lot about. They haven't played high-profile games in the first 2 weeks. Had some struggles here or there, and then ended up putting up some decent numbers. I know a lot of people might say that BYU was a high-profile game for LSU, but you probably got some insight into why that probably isn't the case. But what I'd love to talk about first in this game with BYU or with LSU and Miss State is the fact that there's a 6-point, I think it's about a 6-point spread right now, and we're going to get to scores later, but talk about why this isn't a bigger spread for an LSU team that's traditionally been kind of, one of the cream of the crop in the West, and a Miss State team that's struggled in the last few years. Talk about why you think that spread is as close as it is, and whether or not Vegas is setting us up for a sucker punch.
Well, the obvious thing here with LSU is you have to look back at the two games they've played. They played a team that was a warm body, honestly, right? In UT Chattanooga, and then they played BYU in the opener. BYU was a pretty well-hyped game. Everyone was pretty excited, but BYU, due to the wonders of scheduling, has actually played 3 games at this point, and they opened with Portland State. For anyone that isn't aware, and I think most LSU fans are aware of this, and most SEC fans in general, but BYU put Portland State away late to win 20-6 in that game. It was a struggle all day. Portland State more or less controlled the line of scrimmage from start to finish. So once we saw that happening, we knew the LSU BYU game wasn't going to be terribly exciting. We didn't really talk about it a ton. We sort of touched on it, and neither one of us really expected that to be anything more than a slugfest. So, when we say that LSU has really been tested against BYU, it's no fault of LSU that BYU wasn't a great team, but the reality is they weren't a great team. And they lost last week. BYU lost last week again to Utah. They're now 1-2 in the season. It's probably going to be one of the worst years in recent memory for BYU. Again, not really anything that's a true negative against LSU. It's not like it drags them down or makes them worse just because their opponents are worse. But at the end of the day, BYU was not a great team. And, that victory, 27-0, wasn't exactly a showstopper. That said, I do think there's some things we can take from that game, and we can start kind of getting into what we've seen from both teams, from what little, obviously Mississippi State's played even less competition going into this year, and, maybe how they've both improved from the years prior.
Well, and one of the things I'd like for you to touch on that's probably not exactly in the frame of what you just posed was my whole thing that I talk about in terms of how we view teams and rankings. Even though it's real early in the season and we don't know how BYU season is going to play out, but before we get into how these two teams have improved or maybe fallen back a little bit, does the BYU game fit into the mold of the thing that bugs me about giving a team a lot of credit for a win when they look kind of ugly and they should have steamrolled the team? Or is this a game in BYU LSU that was just kind of ugly from the start, and we can't kill LSU for it, even if BYU is a bad team for various reasons, including just being the start of the season?
Well, I think there's probably a fair point there. I know a lot of LSU fans probably don't like to hear this, but something we really ragged on last year was the fact that Darius Geis really benefited from a situation where he only played the weaker teams, or only got really large numbers of carries. Why do I say that? Because it opened up with Wisconsin, who we picked last year. We said that was going to be the worst possible matchup for LSU. We had it flagged, very huge red flag waving around saying that is an absolute upset alert game, simply because that was the worst possible team in terms of what they were good at and what they were bad at for LSU to play. Um, Geis got 2 carries in that game. He got 5 carries against Mississippi State last year, 3 carries against Auburn, so didn't really see the field against the better teams. Fournette goes down, and so Geis gets 17 carries against Missouri, 16 carries against Southern Miss, 16 against Ole Miss, and those were all rush defenses that were 100th or worst in the country. Against Alabama, again, Fournette came back, so Geis only got 2 carries. Geis comes back in against Arkansas, gets 21, got 19 carries against Florida, and then 37 against A&M, 26 against Louisville. Point being, in those games where he did get a ton of carries, he was also, by and large, I think all but 1 or 2 of them were 80th or worse in the country in rush defense. And so going into this game, one of our curiosities was, how good is Geis really? Can he steamroll someone that is a reasonably good rush defense? And honestly, they really didn't. I mean, they rushed the ball 27 times, 4.5 yards per carry. He did have 2 touchdowns, but 4.5 yards per carry is not dominant. 4.5 yards per carry is, just kind of making par, really. You want to hit 4 yards per carry or above. Anything above 5, you're moving the ball well. 4.5 is doing just well enough to really consistently move the football. So, with that said, the next question is, how much better does Danny Etling look? Well, he was 15 of 18 in the BYU game, 183 yards. Okay, well, I guess
14 of 17. Miles Brennan had a pass, and he has to get his credit too. Come on now. Miles is going to be mad when he's listening to this show.
So,
just kidding. We know he's not listening. But yeah.
Sorry.
Anyway, Danny Etling, right now, 14 17.
The result of that was, I did think Danny Etling looked better, honestly. There were some throws down the field. Hit a real deep ball that I thought was pretty. And just looked pretty good throughout the game. Still, that lack of arm talent shows up, and there were a lot of passes sideline to sideline that weren't overly pretty. But at the end of the day, I think the most important thing is they were going to try to run the ball first on a team that, in BYU, that really did struggle in their opener against Portland State, maintaining the line of scrimmage. Portland State, they didn't dominate on the ground. They only averaged about 3 yards per carry, but it's an FCS team, man. And they were getting a lot of push.
I will say we're bagging on Portland State a little bit, but that's a team that usually gets one kind of high profile FBS win, on the West Coast every year. So they're no slouch. I know it's, again, no big deal to take Oregon State to the wire, but they took Oregon State to the wire. So they've got enough talent and athletes to at least play with these FBS teams. It's not like someone that everybody would steamroll. So I agree with what you're saying. I just want people who maybe aren't familiar with this program to know that they're better than the average FCS school.
Right, and that's a fair point. But when the caveat you give is they're better than the average FCS school, that's not exactly a ringing endorsement, right? And I think what LSU did against BYU is very good, but I just want to keep it in perspective that, again, much like we said last year, LSU kind of gets really hyped when they get to the point where they can run the ball for 6 yards per carry or more. But once you start dropping that below 5, things start slowing down tremendously. Just because at 4.5 yards per carry, you're averaging, 13.5 yards per 3 plays. Any variation there, right? Just one play that goes behind the line of scrimmage, you get tackled for a 1-yard loss, suddenly becomes really hard to get 11 yards and 2 downs. So LSU's still kind of at that threshold. Again, we don't know a whole lot about these teams, but I say all that to sort of lead into the second point, which is that Mississippi State has actually looked pretty darn good offensively and defensively, especially compared to how they were last year. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind when you look at Mississippi State and LSU is that they're not the same teams they were a year ago. They differ in differing ways. Fournette's not there for LSU. They're probably not going to be the dominant run team. But I think the biggest thing is really the offensive and defensive lines. It's always the telling story in college football, and especially in the SEC, if one team has an edge. And last year, Mississippi State's defense was frankly terrible. Um, I don't know another way to put it, uh, besides the fact that they were just flat out bad, right? I mean, they only averaged about 4.76 yards per carry allowed on the ground, but most of their games they averaged over 4 yards per carry. At the end of the season, they gave up over 7 yards per carry to Alabama, 8.5 to Arkansas, who couldn't even run the ball for crying out loud. Gave up right at 4.5 yards per carry last year to LSU, and maybe if you were to try to figure out the key overriding point, it's that we're wondering why the LSU Mississippi State line's close. And last year, LSU's yard per carry average at 4.5 yards per carry is right at what LSU averaged in the BYU game at 4.52 yards per carry. So everything right now sort of stacks up to be the same kind of game it was last year. The only caveat is, well, it's twofold. One, you have Matt Canada at LSU. I've heard a lot of people say they're doing the same thing they did last year. Au contraire, they are not doing the same thing they did last year. LSU in that BYU game did more unbalanced lines and formational shifts and motions than I've seen in a long time. The number of unbalanced lines and shifting, they would shift a tackle and a tight end and just flip them over and over and over to try to get numbers advantages, which was a pretty inventive thing. Wasn't necessarily all that successful, I guess, but it was inventive. And then on the flip side, I think Mississippi State is considerably improved in the front seven in pass rush and run defense. There's a lot of young talent on that line, and it's starting to show. So I'm not really all that shocked by their offense, but the defense I think is the biggest surprise for Mississippi State.
So Miss State probably with to even lesser opponents than LSU to start, and they blew theirs out. And we keep going back to this BYU LSU score. It was 27-0. So kind of like with Nick Saban, I've always talked about how he doesn't necessarily care about an end score. He just cares about certain situational results. When it's a game he knows they're going to win. So LSU fans, don't think we're killing your team completely. We're just trying to figure out, inside the numbers, what Vegas is seeing here. We don't do a lot of odd stuff here, but it is surprising to me that line is a little closer than I expected. I liked your point about Danny Etling. The thing that stuck out to me was 10.1 yards per attempt. 10.1 yards per attempt. That's a lot for him. That shows me that he's able to deliver the ball with a little more significance than he was last year. So I do think, like you, that he might have maybe not turned the corner completely in terms of a threat, but maybe a little more able to bolster that offensive line and give guys some room. So you say Mississippi State's improved. I know when we talked earlier in the season, we did our West preview, you had LSU ahead of Mississippi State. Do you feel like what you've seen so far this season from Mississippi State, even though it's 2 games against 2 kind of no-name opponents, has it moved them up in your West rankings in your mind, or are they improved but still kind of where you had them?
Honestly, they have moved up in my mind. I've been surprised by what I've seen out of Mississippi State. It's worth noting, right? And I'm going to go over it again and again in this, but Mississippi State's defense was just flat terrible last year. It's the way it was. They couldn't stop a paper bag from doing anything. The run defense was decent at 4.7 yards per carry, like we said earlier. The problem was the pass defense was just atrocious. They averaged giving up 7.8 yards per attempt. And there were several teams that had 8, 9, 10 yards. Alabama had about 10 yards per attempt. Arkansas had 11.7 yards per attempt. Heck, Miami of Ohio in the bowl game averaged 8.5 yards per attempt on 31 passes. So it wasn't just like it was 3 fluke plays. So, they needed to show improvement. They needed to show change. And they kind of done that. There's only 4 guys from last year's defense that are going to be starting this year. I've been kind of surprised by the play of guys like Sweat, Adams, Green on the defensive line. I think Jeffrey Simmons, who was a 5-star player, has been a major infusion of talent in the center of the field at nose guard. The corners and safeties aren't necessarily world beaters, but you've got a lot of JUCO players there in that starting 11 because at the end of the day, Mullen is a good coach. He realized he had a problem. He went and got some guys to fill some major holes and needs. They've got a few guys coming back from ACL injuries that are important players. So I think they're significantly improved. Now, last year, the offense really wasn't a huge issue, right? Nick Fitzgerald was kind of hyped up to be an all SEC candidate. We both disagree with that because we both think he's too inconsistent, but they still return a pretty good offense. They return most of their starting offensive linemen. It's a little more sketchy at receiver, but I think maybe I overplayed that because the receiving core last year, frankly, wasn't all that great. So to me, I don't know that Mississippi State is a team that's going to beat most teams still, but that's mainly due to inconsistency at quarterback. And what I could see happening is them keeping games a little bit lower scoring than last year, where they regularly gave up 40 or 50 points. And if they can keep the games to, the 20, 25 point margin with a guy like Fitzgerald that can really stretch the field and strain you schematically, all he's got to do is hit 2 or 3 good passes. He can complete any pass in the field at any given moment. He just may also throw an interception the next play. But when you have a guy like that and you're playing someone like LSU, if they can keep LSU's offense bottled up enough, then all Fitzgerald has to do is hit a couple big plays, generate 14 points, and all of a sudden, those 2 long touchdown passes he manages to throw strikes can be enough to win the game. All you need is a little bit of production otherwise. And I think that's kind of what it comes down to. And I think that's why the line is where it is, because one, Mississippi State's front seven, which was pretty good last year, I think is actually probably significantly improved. And I think they're going to give LSU a hard time running the ball. LSU will be able to do so, but they're not going to be able to sustain drives running the play every down. In the past couple of years, when that's happened, their offense has really slowed to a crawl. And as much as Mississippi State doesn't have breakaway talent, they have enough guys and they have a quarterback that can score pretty much on any given play. And they're just going to take some shots, and all they need is really 2 or 3 drives to. I'm not saying I think they'll win the game, but it's going to take 2 or 3 drives to make it be a 21-14 loss. And boom, you've got your 6.5 point spread. In fact, I'm covering it.
So I think what's interesting about this too is it was a close game last year in in 2 teams that sort of went in different directions. And I think that probably you're looking at a situation that was probably perceived as a negative for LSU to play that close, and a big deal for Miss State. I don't like that at all. I don't like where I was going with that at all. Sorry. All right, you said something about cover. Hold on 1 second. Okay, so we've said some good things about Mississippi State, and I think, like you, that they've improved since last year, even off of what was kind of a tepid ending to their season. Even though they got a bowl win, I think they're a better team than we saw last year in the last game of the season, especially offensively. The thing I like about Fitzgerald is got a 5-to-1 touchdown interception ratio this year, which I think shows a little more maturity in this offense and understanding, that you can't do everything all the time, even though he probably feels that pressure as a playmaker, because there were times last year where he had to completely carry the team, even to make them be competitive in games. So for that, I think he maybe feels a little less pressure, at least so far this season. He hasn't had to be in one of those shootouts, though, so we'll see. We've talked a lot of positive about Mississippi State, and we kind of opened killing LSU a little bit. I have a feeling that you're going to pick LSU, but I'm not going to go there yet. What I want you to do is, without picking LSU or Miss State, let's talk a little bit about LSU and what we know about them that's good. That, Geis we know is good, but you were kind of a little bit, wavering on him. And Etling, we've killed the guy in the past. Tell me some things about LSU that maybe people don't know, because all we know is they lost a ton of talent last year. Tell me some stuff that's good about LSU that would make me feel good if I took them laying the 6.5 points.
Well, I think the biggest thing that's a positive is I do see signs that Matt Canada is finding ways to sort of turn that offense around. And, I said this earlier on, right? But there, people saw a bunch of guys at the line of scrimmage and power run game, and they thought, "Oh, this is the same thing we saw in Les Miles." But in my opinion, that almost can't be further than further from the truth than anybody could imagine. And the reason is, it's one thing to run the ball with just lining five guys up and a tight end and a fullback, and you just do lead block with a fullback, follow them through the A gap. But with Canada, there's been a lot of motions and pulls. They have a pretty athletic line. Guys like Clapp are pretty solid. And they have talent at the tackle position. Malone, Clapp, Weathersby, I mean, they're big players, and they can move. And so they get them around in space a lot. Reorient you with the line of scrimmage. They leverage Moreau, the tight end, by Roddy, and they've been getting them involved by putting them lined up and then switching them out with a tackle, so that you end up with two offensive tackles on the right side of the formation and a tight end playing left tackle essentially. And by doing all that stuff, which honestly reminds me a lot of Stanford, or kind of that old Harbaugh tree with power football, but it's power football with a twist. It keeps you from being able to just line up and know where the ball's going every play. And there are a lot of plays I saw in that BYU game where they would, they'd stack the right side of the line and have an unbalanced line that they've shown three times. And then they had a counter where they would run back to the weak side of the formation, or they would do a little quick pitch to get it wide on that side of the field. And BYU would over pursue because they've been trying to compensate for the unbalanced line on the right. And those little minor things are pretty substantial improvement from what we saw, honestly, under Miles, where frankly you knew when they lined up with a power formation exactly where the ball was going, it seemed like every play. So I think that's one pretty considerable positive. I also think a positive here is LSU's defense is still very good. The front seven has kind of gone up and down the past couple of years, just compared to LSU standards. They've still been very good. They'll be extremely good with Arden when Arden Key's back, but they haven't been the absolute stone wall they've been in some years prior. However, the secondary, they may have lost Jamal Adams, but Dante Jackson, Kevin Tolliver, John Battle are great players. I mean, Ed Paris is also a standout that's basically just not been playing because Jamal Adams has been on the field. So in this game, I don't expect Mississippi State's going to get much separation at all from their receivers, and that's the biggest positive to me if I'm LSU. It's really I'm not gonna. I think people expected more change than makes sense because they can't run a wide open offense. They're breaking in all new receivers. They frankly do not have a great quarterback. He needs to be very limited in what you ask him to do and be a play action guy. But there are things you can do in the run game where you can still pound the ball downhill, but just by changing the blocking schemes and the formations, you can create more opportunities than they've been able to do in the past.
All right, we're gonna stop it right here. Not stop. Gosh, I'm rusty tonight. With all that said, we've got positives on both sides. I think the negatives on both sides are kind of unknown at this point. So what we want to do right now is give you a score. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our show, usually we have a computer model. We need some data, though. We need a few weeks of actual performance on the field before we can feed a computer model anything to give us anything that's significant. And if you've seen it, ESPN's FBI this week, you know why you shouldn't use computers without an appropriate amount of data.
Ohio State's better than Oklahoma, y'all.
It's true. According to the FBI, Ohio State is better than Oklahoma after that game. We made a video last year about how bad the FBI was. We might have to make another one this year. Anyway, rambling aside, well, I've already done it, so it's not aside. I would love to hear your score on this game. LSU, Mississippi State. Tell me who you got.
I do have LSU, but I have it
Told you.
20-17. My opinion on this, and I don't bet. I don't really. I never recommend it because Vegas is too good at what they do. But this looks like a trap bet to me at 6.5. It's lower than most people think it should be. There's some red flags that this is a tough matchup for LSU. They've struggled to beat Mississippi State by more than 7 in recent years too. So I think you could pick Mississippi State in the upset or pick Mississippi State to cover, and it makes sense. I'd be darn hesitant about picking LSU to win by anything more than 7 in this game. I just think it's going to be too tough. That said, I do think LSU wins. It's just going to be close.
I don't gamble because I'll lose. So I have the luxury of giving a score with my gut. I don't have to be beholden to any computer model data this week. So I'm actually going to go more there. I think LSU really shows something on offense this week, and I think Geis does have a good game. I'm going to go LSU 34, Mississippi State 17. I think Mississippi State's going to struggle, like you said, with their receivers being able to get open, and I do think Fitzgerald needs that to be successful. He's a good thrower. He can make most throws on the field, but they relied so much on him running the ball last year, and he was a little bit inconsistent as a passer, especially when he had to press a little bit. He's not a fitted in there kind of quarterback. So with that, I think there's going to be a little bit bigger spread, but honestly, again, because we're so early in the season, I wouldn't be surprised if Mississippi State won the game. We were 2-0 last week picking Georgia and Clemson, but gosh, both of those games, one score could have gone either way. I mean, well, Auburn's offense aside, could have gone either way. But let's say this game goes the way that we both think it will, and LSU wins this game. Looking at Mississippi State's schedule after this, it's kind of brutal. They got LSU at home, then they're at Georgia, at Auburn. Given this 3-game stretch and looking at the rest of their schedule that's got what's in the West, and then they draw Kentucky from the East, BYU and UMass out of conference, could you foresee a situation where the natives get a little restless after going through a really tough early stretch with maybe a couple of losses with Dan Mullen, and then ending with like a 9-win season? Is that feasible? Because I think it is.
It definitely is within the realm of possibility. I mean, the next 3 games are tough. The odds are they probably go 0-3 in those. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility whatsoever that they win one. In fact, I think this is the sort of stretch where they're more likely than not going to lose any of the 3, but they're probably more likely than not going to win one out of the 3, if that makes sense.
It doesn't. Explain that.
So, you see this all the time. People talk about, oh, like, we'll win this game. Oh, then we'll win this one, and then we'll win this one, and we're better than them. We're better than them. But the problem is if you have like a 70% chance, or let's say you have an 80% chance of beating a given team, and you play 5 games, odds say you should really lose one. In fact, if you have an 80% chance of beating teams and you play just 3 or 4 games, the odds are more likely than not you will lose one of the 3 or 4, even though you had an 80% chance of winning any individual one. It's just the way odds work. And the thing that always strikes me was a few years ago, Greg McElroy was doing his like pregame thing, and he's like, all right, and I think Arkansas is going to beat Alabama. And all the Alabama fans flipped out because Greg McElroy said, Alabama's going to lose, and they've never lost to Arkansas ever in their entire history, and they're never going to start now. I mean, it's short attention spans. But the reality was what McElroy was trying to get across, that he wasn't saying that he thought Arkansas would beat them, and he even made this point. He said, look, I think there are 7 teams on the schedule that all have a shot of beating Alabama, and I think one of them gets them. And I'm just throwing a dart, and I'm picking Arkansas. But much like in these games, if you had me pick Mississippi State versus any of these 3 teams, I will pick the opponent each time. But in the aggregate, if you say what's the record between them, I'll say, well, they'll probably go 2-1. I just think, game to game, each one of them is more likely than not going to be the team. In other words, if I think they're going to go 2-1 and I want to make picks, if I pick all 3 of them to beat Mississippi State, I'll go 2-1. If I pick if I try to pick the upset, the odds are I'm probably going to be wrong on which team's going to be upset, and I'll go 1 or 2 or 0-3 in the picks. So that's actually a fun pick'em tip, by the way. If you ever do college football pick'ems, if you're trying to pick upsets, only pick the upset if you genuinely think the upset is more likely than not going to happen. Because if you just pick the favorites every time and there's out of these 5 games, one of them is going to get upset, well, the odds of you actually being right on which one of the 5 is the upset is really low. So if you don't know, what the game is that's going to be the trap, then you do think, well, like in this case, I think Mississippi State should beat all three or should lose to any of the three. But I think the odds are favorable enough for Mississippi State that they'll reach up and grab one of them.
So I posed the question 9-3, is it possible? And you think if you had to put a 0 to 100 on it, assuming they lose to LSU, what would go in 7-2 the rest of the way? What would you say?
I mean, yeah, I think. I mean, it's just tough. I mean, the UGA Auburn game, they're going to have to split between LSU, UGA, and Auburn. I think they're going to have to steal one because I don't think they're going to beat Alabama. But you look at the rest of the schedule. BYU, we already established, isn't a fantastic team. That game is way more winnable than we thought it was at the beginning of the year. I think Kentucky is perfectly winnable. I think A&M is perfectly winnable at this point. They ought to beat UMass. I think they'll be favored against Arkansas, and by the end of the year, they'll probably be favored against Ole Miss. So, it's the same discussion again. I actually think everybody but Alabama, they may well be favored in every one of those games. Now, the odds of them still winning all of them, probably slim. I don't think they're going to win 9 games. I think they're going to win 7 or 8. But I do think it's well within the realm of possibility that they go 9-3, given the schedule. And again, it's just, they have the sort of schedule where there's a few games that I think is like doing any better than 9-3 is almost out of the realm of possibility. But
they have a pretty high floor,
right? They're going to be somewhere between 7 and 9 wins, pretty much almost guaranteed, in my opinion. I mean, they're going to fall in that range just because there's such a big difference between the worst teams in the schedule and the best.
All right, y'all. That's a lot on Miss State, and I'm sorry to the LSU fans that tuned in to hear a lot about LSU. We usually do go in depth with them throughout the year because they play so many massive games, and sometimes Miss State gets left out. And the people who listen to our show know that it's so like Alabama, Auburn, LSU, Florida heavy because those are the teams that do the best. We also want to spend some time on these teams when we get the opportunity, especially when they're playing big games that they have a chance to win, to give them their due. So we did that here. LSU, you're going to get your shot. Don't worry, you're going to get some more love from us.